gentlemen, we welcome you to the fiscal year 17 budget and 2016 legislative wrap-up that ASBA and AASBO do every year. We're lucky this year we have a couple representatives from ASA to help out. First, I want to remind people that we will be recording the webinar, and we'll be posting that on the ASBO website, and I think ASBA will also be posting it on their website, so you can go back and look at any of the things that happened today. I want to also thank Ernie E.J. Nicely from Nicely Done, who does the technical work for us every year and every webinar that we have, and I always tell people that he's our most valuable player. Without him, it would be a silent webinar that you wouldn't be able to see or hear anything, because his technical skills are really needed. Just as we've done in the past, if you type in your questions during the webinar in the chat box, we'll try and answer as many of those as we can get to at the end of the webinar. We want to thank everyone and remind people how important it is to vote. The results, and Tim Ogle from ASBA will give you an update about the current status of things, but when you look at yesterday's election, there was less than a third of the people voting. And those people are basically deciding some really major issues. So no matter whether you're for or against an issue, it's very important to vote. And I just want to remind everybody that we're going to have primary elections and general elections coming up that will shape the legislature for the next 2 years, and it's very important that people are registered. If you're not already registered, make sure you are, and then make sure you vote, especially in the primary, because that shapes the legislature. In the future, the people that make it through the primary are the ones who get on the ballot and ultimately are going to get elected. So we thank everybody for being here, and I want to turn it over to Tim Ogle from ASBA.
Thank you, Chuck. We appreciate everybody's participation today. We're have over 400 registrants, so that tells you the level of interest in this important topic. We're glad you're with us here for the next 90 minutes or so, and we give particular thanks to Dr. Duvall for loaning us Mark and Rebecca from ASA. We also have Darby Jenkins here, our rookie at ASBA on the government relations team, and we're looking forward to good contributions from her in the future. And we also want to recognize Chris Thomas, who's with us remotely. Chris is actually at our national policy study group in Chicago. He's participating remotely, and he is there as one of the national experts in school policy, and will bring back lots of good information, I'm sure. I want to just, as kind of an overview, thank our lobbying team. Many times they don't get the kudos and accolades that they deserve, and I can tell you from firsthand experience the blood, sweat, and tears that each of these individuals has invested in your success and the association's partnerships. Certainly ASA, the team there, and Chuck here at ASBO work very closely with all of the lobbying, educational lobbying team. We want to give special recognition to Elizabeth Hatch, who joined the lobbying team on behalf of ASBA mid-session on loan from Malera Alvarez, and she was just a tremendous asset for us. We also participate, the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of you who were active advocates through our network and contacting legislators along the way. That truly made a difference as those folks got to hear and feel the flavor of those of us out in the field. One of the unusual developments of this session, as we kind of move through lots of the push-pull of a legislative session, are some of the strange partnerships that formed that allowed your associations to leverage our resources. Some of this came from, obviously, from the Prop 301 negotiations and proposals, but also, this newly formed partnership is assuming more and more authority and leverage when it comes to policy and future leverage, and we look forward to using that asset as we move here into the next session and as we look forward. So that all being said, we had some successes and failures, and just a note to everyone on the call before we talk about Prop 123, We're getting a lot of questions about ESSA implementation and the progress of that. As those of you who keep track of these things know, the Every Student Succeeds Act will be replacing No Child Left Behind with implementations beginning this August. ASBA will host the senior leadership team of the Arizona Department of Education to pull out their ESSA implementation plans, and that will occur at our Summer Leadership Institute June 9 and 10 in Tucson. So if you want to come to that, we're planning a large turnout for that particular event as we start to learn about the plans in Arizona for ESSA rollout. That all being said, let me just kind of update folks on today's status when it comes to Prop 123. Many of you, I know, if not all of you, are following the results electronically. I can tell you that we did have conversations with the campaign just a little bit ago, and what we know is that the current lead of 8,774 votes for the yes side of Prop 123 is still shy of about 100,000 votes statewide that have yet to be counted. That is in 6 counties. There's about 10,000 or so in Pima County, a few hundreds in each of Apache, Mojave, Yuma, and Pinal County, and there's about 76,000 votes yet to be counted in Maricopa County. That includes the late drop-off, the last-minute mail-ins, and the provisional ballots. We also know, and Chuck intimated this just a moment ago, that the campaign staffers and politicians, prognosticators, are estimating that the final voter turnout will probably be around 31%, which has added complexity to the narrow margin of victory. But we are confident in looking at the data that the lead will be maintained if all of the trends stay true to their performance over the last 24 hours. That margin of victory will be enough. Obviously, it's too close to call right now with 100,000 votes to go, but the trends are indicating a reason for us to have some degree of optimism. That all being said, with regards to Prop 301, we'll be obviously entertaining questions along the way with regards to that. And just want to appreciate all the field work that was done on behalf of Prop 123. It's a tough political environment with a complicated proposal, and certainly the partnerships that we all have, hopefully will bring us to the yes vote that we all hope for. That's what I have as far as Prop 123. Others?
Chris Thomas, you have a few things to add, correct?
Yeah. A couple things, and I know a number of people have asked me, if this becomes, the lead gets maintained or maybe even drops a little bit, will we be looking at a recount and drawing this out longer? Our state statute is pretty clear that on these kinds of questions, the actual vote difference has got to be less than 200 votes. So that seems to be unlikely. I mean, things would really, really be tight if we get there. So the recount I don't think is going to happen. Now, there could be other challenges based on something else that I'm not aware of, but the state statute is pretty clear on it. The second thing is, what happens legally depending on the outcome. If, the lead holds as we expect it to, we will be very soon be going to court to ask for the case to be dismissed based on the outcome of the referendum. And then also, I've been hearing lots of folks say, well, what about a potential lawsuit with regard to either the need for an enabling act or something about it violating the prudent investment rule. We have to, it remains to be seen what's going to happen with that. I will say this, which is, anybody who thought we were going to sort of trade one lawsuit for another, I think that's sort of a false equivalency argument that was offered, because I think the lawsuit with, should 123 pass and there become a challenge about that, I think that lawsuit is a much quicker one to deal with. The law, I think, is very strongly on our side, and so I would expect that that would be dealt with in very quick order. So, but just be aware that there is that threat out there. We knew that that threat was out there, and we would probably not be taking the lead on that, but we certainly would be there as a very interested party, perhaps as interventionist in that litigation should it happen.
They told us to not expect results before tomorrow. One resource said midday tomorrow for Maricopa County, another said on Friday, so we'll just keep you informed along the way here.
Okay, Chris, anything else?
No, I mean, obviously it was a very close election, and I think one of the other things I would just say is that a lot of people say that well, this just shows that it's kind of surprising that the no vote would be so strong. I'm frankly not surprised. I think anybody who's been hearing from folks over the last time is not that surprised about that. On the yes side, it was a very complicated measure, and complication is tough when it comes down to the legislature, especially in this environment where there's not a whole lot of trust in elected officials. So I understand where the critics are coming from. I understand where the people that were skeptical were coming from. But we did have to do, we had to let them know what it really was and how it would impact schools, and I think we made the best case we could. So either way, I think we left it all on the field.
Yep. And to follow up, we just have some preliminary data coming in indicating that 3 out of 4 voters supported more money for schools, with more than half of those voting saying that Prop 123 was not enough. It was the first step.
Chris, you and I go back a number of years, and I can't remember an election that dealt with state trust lands that wasn't very, very close, either failing or passing. It just seems that anytime people see an issue that involves state trust lands, it evokes a lot of hard feelings and emotions, and none of those ballot measures ever went through except really close one way or the other.
Right, and I think we have an ongoing responsibility to inform the public as best we can about the connection between trust lands and how they support education, and it's not an intuitive thing for most people to understand, so you really have to educate people. I think even with this, we still have that in front of us.
Okay, all right, we'll move through the fiscal year 2017 budget, and we'll go to the first slide dealing with that. First thing I want to do is thank Chris Cable from the Auditor General's Office and Lyle Friesen from the Arizona Department of Education. Have been really working overtime to try and get prepared for where we are now, depending on whether Prop 123 passed, whether it didn't pass, what it does for the budget, and they're hoping to have budget forms out sometime near the end of the month. But they've been doing a lot of work, and I know the school business officials really appreciate all their efforts. This is just a graphic presentation to kind of show the impact of Prop 123 on the base level. I'll be talking about some similar information as we go through, and just remind people that teacher comp, as that was been around for many, many years, and that's the extra 1.25% that gets added to the base level for traditional school districts that qualify. And I believe in Arizona now every school district qualifies for that extra 1.25% for teacher comp. And what we did is show the base level just from Prop 123, which is $3,600 if the election remains being successful, and then what happens when you add comp, and then you see what would have happened if the election was not successful, what the base level would have been both with and without teacher comp. So next slide. This is the details behind that. Again, this is for fiscal year 2016. There's probably about $275, $280 million that'll be coming to schools through this increase in the base level and through the extra $50 million that we'll talk about shortly. But you can see with Prop 123, $3,600 with the extra 1.25% for teacher comp, it's up to $3,645. The important thing about that, those numbers are, that's what future inflation gets calculated off of. So as we move forward, any year that the inflation adjustment is provided, it'll be based off of the original $3,600 as we go forward. And we'll show you pretty soon what it is for fiscal year 2017. And you can see if Prop 123 was not successful, we would have the base level for this year, which is what was used in the calculations, along with the added extra that the legislature put in. For those of you who followed the budget process for fiscal year 16, when the legislature did that budget, they put an extra $54.31 that got added to the base level. It was treated like the base level for all calculations, except it wasn't permanent, and it didn't qualify for inflation increase in the future years. It was referred to as a down payment on getting the lawsuit settled. And you can see what that number would have been, both with, because teacher comp got added to both the base level and that extra $54.31 that the legislature put in place. So this, you can see for fiscal year 16, the increase that's going to come from that $3,600 reset of the base level based upon the settlement of the lawsuit. Next. And then with teacher comp, basically that difference is about $120.44. If you take what the 3645 with teacher comp for Prop 123, and then you take what it would have been with teacher comp and with the extra $54, that's an extra $3,524.56 would have been the base level this year, and would have remained without that increase. That's a difference of about $120. A lot of people misunderstand. They say, well, that's the increase. Well, we have a weighted formula. So all the elementary students are weighted at a little above 1.15, about 15% above 1, and the high school students are a little bit above 26% higher than that. So I think it's more realistic to look at what does that really mean per an elementary student, and the average elementary student in the state would be almost $140 increase that will go into their budgets for this year. And for the high school, it's a little over $152. If you're a small school and you get the small school adjustment, or if you're just one of the students that qualify for special education money, like a visually handicapped or a hearing handicapped student, that number goes up a lot. But that kind of puts you in perspective how much the increase will be. And what most schools have been doing, which you're all aware of, have been putting two budgets together for this year. One would be what would they do with the extra money coming from Prop 123 if it passed, and in many cases had alternative plans based upon a passage and a failure. Next slide. In addition to that, for this year, and going forward, we'll talk about what's available in future years, there's that extra $50 million that was part of the settlement of Prop 123. It wasn't called for back payments or anything of that nature, but it was in addition to the readjustment to the base level. There's an extra $50 million that's going to be available for this year, and then that changes as we go forward, and we'll talk about that very shortly. The important thing to remember on this is it's distributed on a weighted student count, the same formula that's used for the classroom site fund. So districts, when they look at their classroom site fund report that the Department of Ed sends to them, they show them what percentage they have of the total weighted student count in the state, and not including disabled students, only the basic weighted students for the Group A category of students. And if you have 1% of all the kids in the state, you get 1% of that $50 million, and that'll be distributed to school districts this year. It's put into the budget limit calculation and can be used for any purpose that any other normal budget increase could be used for. It gets added to your budget limit calculation and actually increases your budget capacity for this year, and then we'll look a little bit shortly about what happens with fiscal year 2017. Next. And now let's start looking at fiscal year 2017. That's similar to that first slide we looked at, again, to look at the base support level with Prop 123, what it is when teacher comp gets added, and get to compare that to what the base level would have been with teacher comp and without teacher comp had Prop 123 failed. And again, to stress what was talked about earlier, the nice thing about the passage of it is that by raising that base level in fiscal year 16, all future calculations are based off of that number. And the next slide will show the detail of that. And there you have, again, with Prop 123, what the base level will be. with teacher comp, it's $3,681.09. And if it had not passed, and it was, and ultimately it didn't, if for some reason it didn't pass, you can see the base level would have been quite a bit lower because it would have been based off of the old number from fiscal year 16, and now we're working off of that new number. And the next slide kind of shows how that looks when you compare the change from with Prop 123 and without Prop 123. The difference for next year is about $122.18. The reason for that is you're basing the inflation off of a higher number, and you can see that's a little almost $142 per student, a little over $141 for an elementary student, and again almost $155 per student when you apply the weights. If you're a district or a charter school with small, that gets a small school adjustment, obviously the increase in the base level is magnified. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. The $50 million in fiscal year 2017 will be distributed just as it was in fiscal year 16. Once you see what your amount is for fiscal year 16, your amount for fiscal year 17 would be fairly close to that, unless you had some changes in your student population. But again, it'd be based upon the same weighted student count that it was calculation that's used for the classroom site fund. And looking at what happens over future years, that $50 million for the first 5 years is $50 million, and then for the second 5 years going out through fiscal year 2025, it goes up to $75 million a year. But all of those years, it's basically distributed on the weighted student count, Group A weighted student count. One thing that's interesting is that this extra $50 million will going forward will be based upon prior year count. And later on we talk about that in a little more detail, but the base level funding that we talked about, since it's part of the base level, and that's going to be based upon current year funding moving forward, but the 50 million and the 75 million are always based upon the prior year calculation. And the next slide. One of the things that was done when people were working with the legislature is there's provisions in the state that you can't, it's a gift of public money if you pay someone more than what their contract that they agreed to stated. And as part of the legislation that was passed, they're basically for this year, fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17, that additional funding restriction does not apply. Districts have the ability to add money because of this increase coming from Prop 123. The other thing is, and with a change in the legislature, it's not as important as it originally was, but basically any of the money received from Prop 123 would have no limit on the budget carry forward. Later on we'll talk about where the total limit on carry forward monies were removed, but the bill that the legislature passed took it off for any of these dollars. And the budget revision deadline with the passage of Prop 123 is extended to June 30th, 2016. So schools will have until June 30th to revise their budgets, which they're going to need to do because of the additional monies coming in, and get those budgets submitted to the Arizona Department of Education. Now we'll move to current year funding, which was one of the big issues in the legislature this last session. And it's interesting the way it worked out, that the calculation for the base support level, and that's in ARS 15943, and the calculation for the base support level for JTEDS, which is in 15-943.02, those are the only things that get moved to current year funding. All the other parts of the formula, and the way it's actually written, the definition for student count remains for all of Title 15 on a prior year. And the only place where it's not going to be prior year is when it's specifically stated in a section of law that it's an exemption or an exception. And it's right now it's just going to be in that calculation of the base support level. This would be for fiscal year 2017. but everything else, override calculations, small school exceptions, or classroom site fund, instructional improvement, which is Indian gaming, all of the other provisions in the formula that are related to student count will still remain on a prior year count. And that's the way the law is written, and unless the legislature changes it in another section of law, that section of law will still remain on prior year count. Now we're talking about special provision for declining districts. And this was one of the major issues in the legislature right up until the last day of the session, where people really wanted to make sure that something was done to help declining school districts so that by moving to current year count in fiscal year 2017, they would not suffer a loss and basically have a budget cut. And basically what the legislation that finally got through does, it basically backfills the loss of base support level funding for districts that would be declining from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 17. So if you're going to have less students next year under current year funding, you would have lost money because you're not going to be able to use the calculation on the prior year count of students. But with this change in legislation, if you're a declining district, you'll be able to use this year's student count, fiscal year 2016, as your number when you do your formula calculation. The legislature appropriated $31 million to the Department of Ed, and that was one of the issues near the end was $31 million enough? Because no one knows what the decline is going to be into next year. Was it not enough? Was it too much? But the legislature did appropriate $31 million, but then through the hard work of a number of legislators demanding a change be made, they did put a provision in the law that basically says the Department of Ed will fund whatever that actual increase is. If it was less than $31 million, then they don't need any additional money. If it was more than $31 million, they could go into the base calculation for basic state aid and use some of those monies. So that change in the formula for declining districts will be there, no matter what the calculated cost may be. Next slide is district additional assistance. And just to remind people that nothing really changes for next year. This is still a major issue for school districts across the state, and used to be capital outlay revenue limit, coral money, and soft capital were combined to form district additional assistance a couple of years ago. But what's interesting is if you look at the amount that is per pupil, it's exactly to the penny the same amount per pupil that it was in fiscal year 1999. District additional assistance, which came out of coral and soft capital. Since coral and soft capital didn't have any increases since 1999, that number's the same as it is today. Obviously, if an issue with school districts is what it costs to provide capital items in their district and capital improvements. Things certainly cost a lot more than they did. But if the formula was fully funded, it would only be at the same amount per pupil that it was in 1999. However, there's a reduction, and the reduction for next year, fiscal year 17, is exactly the same as the reduction was for this year, and it's over $352 million. That's a reduction in state funding. The actual cuts to district additional assistance are even greater than that, because if you're a non-state aid district, you have to cut your capital district additional assistance, your capital limit, the same as if you were a state aid district. So the Department of Ed goes in and figures out how much the reductions have to be to state aid districts to save $352 million, and then the reduction, if that was a 70% reduction or whatever that reduction is, non-state aid districts get that cut to their budget capacity even though they don't get any state aid. But it's $352 million, which is the same as this year, so the reduction to district additional assistance should be somewhat similar. Not only does it reduce the state funding, but it reduces the budget limits for districts, and whether you're a state aid or a non-state aid district. There is a cap on reductions for smaller districts that have less than 1,100 students. The Department of Ed first goes and figures out what would the reductions be at a maximum of $5 million for those districts, which is less than the general reduction, and then they calculate what the reduction is to the rest of the districts. a lot of districts who I talk to are looking at maybe only getting 15 to 18% of what the formula should be providing to them. So it's an issue that's very troublesome and causing a lot of problems in school districts, especially going on year after year. The next slide, charter school additional assistance. You can see it's a totally different formula for charters. The charter additional assistance has gotten an inflation increase every year. Even when the lawsuit was going forward about the calculations, I believe they still gave the increase to charters. And you can see it's up to about $1,752 for primary preschool through 8th grade, and then it's over $2,000 for students in grades 9 through 12. Their reduction remains the same as it was in fiscal year 16. It's the same reduction in fiscal year 17 of just over $18 million. Next one is transportation. That's one of the things that always got an increase, even though in the years when the lawsuit was coming forward on increasing the base level, the legislature felt that if they increased transportation, that qualified for doing the inflation adjustment. So that has gotten an increase every year, and for next year, that'll go up 0.99%. That was the inflation factor for both the base level and for transportation and for charter additional assistance. All got just a fraction less than a 1% increase for inflation, and you can see it goes up to $256 or you wish $2.56 or $2.09 depending on which part of the formula you qualify. Next is district-sponsored charter schools. That was another major issue in the legislature. A number of legislators worked really hard to at least keep this cut from going forward for one more year. District-sponsored charter schools are in fiscal year 16. We're only getting about half of what they should be getting for full funding, and that was scheduled to go to zero, no funding in fiscal year 2017. The legislature, through a group of legislators who held together really hard and said that they wanted the change in the budget that basically keeps that, doesn't increase the cut, keeps it at 50% for one more year, and then it's gone altogether. The next thing we'll talk about is a rollover. The rollover for K-12 remains the same. What the legislature did this last session is they had a rollover, I believe it was $200 million for universities, and they paid the universities off and ended that rollover, but the rollover for traditional districts stay at $930 million. The payments, so $930 million that districts should have been paid this year. They're not going to get paid till after July 1, but they will get paid before July 12th under last year's budget law. And under this year's budget law, the rollover stays the same. So when the districts finish their year at June 30th, they're going to have $930 million that they haven't been paid, that they earned in fiscal year 17, and the legislature will make the treasurer and the Department of Ed will make those payments to schools by the 12th of July in 2017. The rollover does not apply to charter schools or districts with a student count less than 600 students. Next slide is another thing that was happening during the legislature, and Mark's going to join me on some of this discussion because it was a major issue where the legislature wanted to make it harder for growing districts to qualify for a new school because they currently can exclude some of their space in deciding whether they qualify. And we really appreciate Mark on this one because he was the first one who found out that it was in the budget when the budget was still, in fact, I don't even ask him how he got it, but when the budget was still top secret and nobody was supposed to know what it was, he picked up on that particular item, and then he was able to, and the rest of us were able to tell school districts, hey, you need to tell your legislators how bad this is going to be, and that was a big plus that they could get it stopped before it actually got into the budget. So I guess Mark's still not going to tell us how he got it, but it was a big plus that he was able to have that information and we could get it shared with people.
We were just happy that it was made invisible in the final budget and it passed, and so it wasn't changed.
And invisible basically means that up to 25% of the extra space that school districts add when they build new schools, they don't have to count it in the SFB formula, so it's commonly referred to as invisible space. Now, building renewal grants. This is important for districts, I think, to be aware of, is that the legislature did add some additional money that'll be available for school districts for building renewal grants. A number of districts probably need to take a look at applying if you do have needs to make sure that your buildings are meeting your adequacy guidelines that the state has, even if you don't think you're actually going to qualify for the funding because they're going to run out of money or whatever it may be. Because what happens is when the legislature asks the SFB, well, what districts are complaining about they don't have enough money for building renewal, what were your grant requests? And a lot of times they say, well, we didn't even get a grant request that was in excess of the money that we had available. So it's really important if you have an issue that not only to see if you do qualify and get those additional dollars for your district, that's an important thing, but if they run out of money for whatever the reason may be, it's important that that be on the record so that we can continue to tell the legislature the problems and the challenges that districts are facing with building renewal since they eliminated the building renewal formula a number of years ago. Next one is on JTEDs. The first one is the large JTEDs for the last few years have been any JTED with more than 2,000 students. I believe there's just a couple of them in the state. They get funded at 95.5% of what the formula says their funding level should be. And the base support level calculation for JTEDs for next year will be based upon current year funding. Now, I've talked to a couple of people, and it seems unclear if any JTED is declining. The issue would be, I believe they may very well qualify for that same provision that traditional districts have. But no one was sure if there were any declining JTEDs. But basically, JTEDs for their base funding, their base support calculation for next year will use current student count, just like all the districts will. Student growth funding, if you look through the statutes and you see that that's repealed, that wasn't a bad thing, because by going to current year funding, the student growth formula was not needed anymore. Districts with all districts, as they're growing, are going to be funded on current year counts, so they wouldn't need that. So 15948 was repealed and no longer will show. Pilot funded program. There were two programs that the legislature approved near the end of the session. One is $500,000 for competitive grants at the Department of Education, and I'm sure the Department of Ed will be coming out with guidelines and procedures on this. It basically, the American Indian Advisory Council of the Department of Education is to evaluate their grant applications and make award recommendations. And then a new program which did not provide any funding for fiscal year 2017, but may be implemented and put in place for when funding does become available, again, depending on how the Department of Ed and the State Board of Education would look at that. But that's college credit for examination incentive pilot programs. Students that get college credit for courses at their high school, advanced placement classes and programs similar to that. This is to give them some money, to give them an incentive to expand those programs and have an incentive for teachers and for school districts. Now we'll go to the actual bills that were chaptered, and Darby's done a really good job of putting all this, the PowerPoint and stuff together. Some of the bills don't have a chapter number yet. It doesn't mean that they aren't going to be go into effect, but either the governor had not signed them yet, or they haven't been sent over to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State gave them a chapter number. So the first one is Chapter 4, and that happened very early in the session. That was the JTED restoration and reforms legislation. Basically what that did, and we've spent time reviewing this before, and so most of you are probably very familiar with it, that I reduced the cuts to JTEDs, I think, by 29 million out of the 30 million reductions that were there. Passed very early in the legislative session, and basically changed the funding formula back to where it was, so some of the cuts won't have to be implemented. And then the second part of that slide modifies some requirements, but the important thing is that the bill basically is funding JTEDs and reforms, and there's a number of reforms that were part of that legislation. The Auditor General met with our ASBO people on May 11th to kind of go over some of the additional data requirements that districts and JTEDs are going to have to put together and submit additional information. So that'll be part of gathering information related to the reforms. The next bill is Chapter 2480, or chapter, it doesn't have a chapter yet, House Bill 2481, schools primary tax rate. Remember early on we talked about budget balance carry forward, and what House Bill 2481 does is it eliminates any limit on budget balance carry forward. So not only would the extra money that districts are getting from Prop 123 not have any carryover limit, no longer a carryover limit exists. The bills, as we probably should have mentioned it earlier, take effect on August 6th. So the legislation, unless it has an emergency clause, as was mentioned earlier, doesn't take effect until August 6th. But there is a provision in statute, and I believe the Auditor General's office and the Department of Ed have looked at this, and any time the legislature makes a change to the funding formula for schools, including the calculation of budget limits, that goes into effect right from July 1 on. So from the information we've received is that the budget forms that the Auditor General will put out for next year basically will have the provision in there where there is no longer a 4% limit on the amount of money that can be carried over. The second part, which was a major part of the bill, changes how the primary tax rate is calculated, and most people who have looked at this don't believe that this will change how the tax rate gets set this August, because it doesn't take effect until August 6th, and by then all the information from the districts and the county school offices has been put together. But basically, most likely for the following year, fiscal year 18, as the tax rate gets set, it'll be different than in the past, where the school districts provided the county with information about how much their spending formula was, how much cash they had on hand, and how much money they needed to fund their budget. This basically will have your primary tax rate, not the secondary rate, not including overrides or bonds, but your primary rate based upon what the formula would allow you to spend. So there's a difference. The transportation revenue control limit, which is what districts are allowed to spend to as part of the transportation formula, versus the transportation support level, the TSL, which is what districts get in state funding. That difference is funded with local monies. Small school exemptions funded with local monies. DSEG is funded with local monies. Adjacent ways is funded with local monies. So basically you would look at how much money do you need to fund your share of the equalization formula through the qualifying tax rate, and then how much money do you need to fund these other additional allowable expenditure monies, and the tax rate would get set to whatever it takes to fund to that limit. There would be some adjustments for prior year errors, but cash balances would no longer be used to adjust the cash balance based on a formula of what the allowable expenditures are. The next one is House Bill 2476. This was the Kyrene School District. Was probably the primary mover on this. Probably one of the most complicated sections in the law was ARS 15-1102, on school plant fund. I didn't understand it. Nobody understood it. People would kind of guess what it meant, and it was just very confusing and difficult. Caused problems with districts being able to decide how they're going to spend the money that they get from selling property, selling equipment, leases and rentals and things of that nature. So this basically, it happens very rarely do they actually repeal a statute and then replace it with another set of language. So most times they do some revisions or modifications, but basically this will change 1102, so instead of having multiple school plan funds, you only have one school plan fund. It makes it more clear as to what districts can do and not do. There's still some concerns that Kyrene and a couple other districts had, that they want to see the impact of bonding limits adjusted a little bit, but just now you have a bill that's more workable and is easier for schools to understand, and certainly make it easier for them to plan on how to use some of the money that they get from school leases and school sales. Next one is Chapter 2054, Debt Limitations, Net Assessed Value. We had Randy Stein do a presentation at our last ASBO meeting, and probably the best way of explaining this is it keeps everything the way it always has been. So when districts calculate their debt limit for bonding, they'll use the same net assessed value of the full cash value as they've used in the past to do that calculation. So the way you calculated your debt limit 3 years ago, 5 years ago, is the way you would still continue going forward. So there's no change from existing methods. Next one is Chapter 87, House Bill 2294. Charter school special education funding. It allows charter schools to apply for the Extraordinary Special Education Needs Grant. Traditional school districts could already apply for the Extraordinary Special Education Needs Grant. The problem is no one thinks there's ever been any money funded for the Extraordinary Special Education Needs Grant. But maybe this is a good thing, that since charters can apply and it's kind of got surfaced, maybe we'll look at that'll be looked at again, and basically it's for school districts, and it would be for charter schools when you get a very high cost special ed student that you don't have the money to fund. But we'll be interested to see how that actually gets implemented over time, but it basically makes charter schools eligible for a fund that districts have been eligible for, but to the best of everyone's knowledge hasn't been funded. Next bill is House Bill 2190, and I think Chris is going to talk a little bit about this bill. We've only included some of the components of it because the bill is I think 40 or 50 pages all by itself. Everything near the end of the session that people wanted to get in the bill that they didn't get in, they got added. So probably this would need to be, this is almost a webinar all by itself. But anyway, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, 2190 is a massive bill. A lot of things that are in there that are, I would say, are good. Not a lot of things that are really bad. Just a couple things that you'd want to know about. In addition to the changes that you see there, it allows a community college district of any size to be a sponsoring entity for a charter school. And that used to be only for those districts over 15,000. So that was a change. It cleans up the pest management notification statutes, as you can see there, which was very onerous and very restrictive, and it's much more workable now, and I think they listened to a lot of input on that. It eliminates the requirements to maintain resumes for both charter schools and school districts. That was kind of antiquated, didn't really make a lot of sense. So what you do have to have in its place is you have to keep all the educational background information in personnel files of your employees, and obviously it's something that's to make sure that they are qualified to perform the functions that they've been assigned. So much less onerous requirement to have, other than to have a current resume. The smoking policy, the requirement to have a smoking policy is eliminated. That's a no-brainer since smoking in public buildings is illegal anyway. It defines the duties of teachers and principals in policy. That's included, and as part of that, it changes where we are going to require that there be a teacher-parent satisfaction survey. It eliminates a number of curriculum mandates, such as the requirement to educate students about organ donation, stranger danger, a few other things that are kind of been there for a while, that we consider those to be good things. But honestly, I think the most important thing it does is it eliminates the requirement to charge a fee for an activity, an extracurricular activity, to be eligible for extracurricular tax credits. That was one I have to give a tip of the hat to the Chandler Unified School District. That was an issue that they worked on for a number of years. The Attorney General's office had opined that because of the way the statute was written, you couldn't apply tax credit monies to any program where there wasn't at least a fee required to participate. And that eliminates that. It basically says that you can charge a fee, but you're not required to for it to be tax credit eligible. Next slide, please. House Bill 2233, this one allows the state fire marshal to enter into an IGA with local school districts, and if you do so, those local fire codes will apply if you do that. And this was not controversial, and we supported it. Next one. This House Bill 2338, now Chapter 131, it prohibits a governing board from prohibiting a person from possessing or carrying a deadly weapon in a person's vehicle on a public right-of-way. This is one that's an interesting one because the Gun Free Schools Act does have a limitation. I think it's 75 feet around a school, but there's some questions about whether or not that's truly legal and whether or not the feds overstepped their authority by not limiting it just to school grounds. This one makes it clear that if you're on an adjacent right-of-way, you happen to be driving by or what have you, you're not breaking the law if you have a firearm and you're otherwise legally possessing it.
Chris, wasn't this a bigger issue for universities where they had streets running through the middle of their campuses?
Absolutely, yes, it is. It's not really one for us, but yes, but it's something that that I know many of. If they're publicly maintained and you have a number of people that are able to access it, why shouldn't the same rules apply? Okay, next one.
I think the next is Mark.
Yep.
Thank you. House Bill 2544 and Senate Bill 1321. These are a pair of identical bills that were introduced by the chair of the House Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee. The bills were promoted by the chamber as part of their education initiatives. The bill that ended up passing was House Bill 2544, which requires the State Board of Education to adopt a number of locally procured achievement assessments that, once adopted by the State Board of Education, could be used by schools as a substitute for the statewide assessment. Then there's a process that LEAs can use to request specific assessments be added to the approved list that the State Board of Education makes available to schools. The legislation includes a number of requirements that the State Board of Education must use when considering establishing and adding assessments to the list of acceptable assessments. The criteria includes a demonstration that the assessment scores can be equated for state accountability programs, including establishing comparable student assessment scores and performance profiles and letter grades. And this demonstration must be evaluated by a third-party provider chosen by the State Board of Education. There's some additional requirements in here as well. Pretty substantial piece of legislation related to assessments. The next bill is Senate Bill 1430. This was a result of a working group pulled together by the State Board of Education to begin the process of rebuilding and replacing the A through F accountability system. The working group had representation from ASA, ASBA, and some of the other education groups. Largely what this bill does is remove from statute the old A through F accountability model and gives the State Board of Education, with input from qualified technical experts and policy stakeholders, basically the stakeholder group that created the legislation, the authority to create a new accountability system. It specifies some of the elements or components the new system has to include and establishes some minimums of the new achievement profiles and what indicators have to be used.
Okay, next one I think
next
is
one is mine, I guess. All right, Senate Bill 1249, which is awaiting a chapter. It allows a newly founded unified school district, a district that basically has been converted to a unified school district, to continue to calculate its budget in the same way it has recently until its high school has been constructed, and they have until 2020 to do that. I believe this was for one particular school district. Was it Natterburg, I believe?
Natterburg is right.
Natterburg, it is right. So they've got a couple of years to get their high school built, and they can still be have their budget calculated as though they are a unified school district. Okay, next one. Senate Bill 1457. You know, normally when the legislature goes on after the budget's done, and it goes on for some period of time, nothing good happens. Well, this bill is an example of where sometimes something good does happen. The underlying bill itself is one that was really not that controversial. Even Democrats who don't support ESAs supported this. What it did was, and what it does is, allows disabled students up to the age of 22 that had an IEP to get an ESA. And again, that was not controversial, but in the waning hours of the session, it became a vehicle to allow for an amendment that would allow for the continuation of KidsCare, and which was very controversial during the session, and it looked like it had died because the Senate leadership did not want it to come for a vote, but they forced a vote on this because they amended this bill and allowed the program to continue. It will terminate, however, if the federal government ever decides to eliminate the funding, because right now the way it works is it doesn't cost the state anything to continue. Next one. And the next one, Senate Bill 1280 is also an ESA bill, but it's one that really deals with mostly a little bit of eligibility questions, but it doesn't expand it greatly. What it does is it says if students are preschool students who have disabilities, they are now eligible to participate in an ESA. If you're a sibling of an eligible student who's already been approved, they're allowed to join in or have an ESA. A child whose parent is legally deaf, blind, or hard of hearing is also included in the qualified student, as well as any allowing for a child with an IEP or Section 504 plan that requires specialized instructional materials. So not a huge expansion. We'll talk about it in the failed bills that there was one major piece of legislation that looked to expand ESAs, and we're almost certain to see that again in the future. But for the most part, this bill was just a modest increase in terms of eligibility, as well as actually having some accountability things that made sense for the administration of the program.
Chris, I just had it's an error that I made in there. The very last one about requires ADE to allocate monies annually. That really should be the parent. The change they made was that the parent. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at an older version. Right. So okay. So I didn't make any mistakes. So people take that back.
No, the older
that would have been very surprising if that were true.
And we'll give you a pass on the older version comment.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay, 1376. Now this is an interesting one. This says that you're allowed to consolidate under existing statute if you're two school districts that are within 20 miles of each other and you both have been graded A or B school districts. In other words, right now the current statute requires that you be contiguous or coterminous or adjacent. This one would allow districts to essentially be separated by another district and join as one district so long as they're both considered to be A and B districts. It's still voluntary, it does not require them to be so, but it gives the authority to those districts to consolidate should they choose to. Next one.
All right. House Bill 2234. This is a fairly simple bill. It requires independent auditors to send school district audit reports to the county school superintendent. Currently, these reports are just sent to the Auditor General's office. Okay.
Okay, so House Bill 2088, which doesn't have a chapter number yet, the short title is Schools, Assessment, Surveys, Informed Consent. It's a pretty lengthy bill. The final product that was signed today by the governor is significantly different than the introduced product. So this bill says that school districts and charter schools must obtain written informed consent from parents before they can administer a survey to a student. The definition of survey in the bill is pretty restrictive to 14 questions that school districts typically aren't asking these types of questions of students anyway. And in the final bill, there are a few exemptions to the written informed consent requirement. Those exemptions include surveys or assessments related to mental health screening or screening for disabilities, any sort of classroom discussion, assignments or instructions, but so long as they're within the purview of the course. Nationally recognized college entrance exams, like the ACT or SAT. Any survey that doesn't collect the name of the student, so any anonymous survey, is not required for the consent. And any survey administered by the Criminal Justice Commission, or any sort of surveying or questioning of a student that's coming from a school employee related to mandatory reporting requirements for abuse or neglect. So it's a pretty different bill than what was exempt, and parents can revoke their consent at any time during the year. And there are penalties on districts, but they're not automatic penalties, and the bill specifically says they cannot exceed $500. There was a provision in the original bill that said responses to these surveys can't be included in school administrator and teacher rating systems. And with the last amendment on the bill, that was taken out.
Okay, we're back to Darby.
Yeah. This next bill we have is House Bill 2620, which was brought forward by the State Board of Education and the Superintendent of Public Instruction to settle the ongoing lawsuit that began last year. The language of the bill tried to make its way onto several other bills before it passed out of both chambers on 2620. The bill is intended to clarify the roles and responsibilities of both the board and the Superintendent of Public Instruction. The language specifies that the superintendent is responsible for department employees and the investigative unit, and that the state board is required to supervise the duties of its employees and no longer has to employ on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. The next bill is House Bill 2265, and this one deals with EpiPens, and it only applies to authorized daycare facilities within a school district. School districts still must follow 15157, which covers the emergency administration of epinephrine auto-injectors. The language of this bill allows authorized entities, which daycare facilities fall under, to acquire, stock, store, and supply epinephrine auto-injectors. It also allows employees to administer an epinephrine auto-injector to anyone they believe in good faith is experiencing anaphylaxis, regardless of diagnosis. The language permits authorized entities, and it's not a mandate. The next bill. This is a bill that we have seen in various forms over the past couple of years. It deals with CPR instruction. This version has minimized the requirements and has also given some added flexibility to school districts. The bill allows school districts until 2019 to provide one session of CPR training to students in high school. It allows schools to assign this as homework as long as parents or teachers sign off on it. And it also allows contributions to support CPR training to qualify under the Public School Tax Credit Program. All right, Senate Bill 1502. The intention of this bill was to address the teacher shortage within CTE programs. The sponsor introduced the bill with the help from organizations like AEA and the AZ Chamber of Commerce to make the process easier. The bill requires the state board to issue CTE certificates to qualified individuals who have expertise in the area, 5 years experience in the field, and comply with fingerprinting and background check requirements. Additionally, those who qualify for this certificate do not have to complete the U.S. and Arizona Constitution courses, the SEI endorsement, or pass each component of the proficiency exam. This next one is a big one for everyone, especially those with school gardens. It allows fruits and vegetables grown in public school gardens that are cut and washed on site for immediate consumption to be exempt from safety regulations by the Department of Health Services. It was said that the sponsor's hope was to get more students knowledgeable about where food comes from and making healthy choices. All right, the next one, we've seen it before, but last year it got lost on Sine Die, so the sponsor brought it back to address these issues. It deals with the K-3 reading program. The bill transfers the administrative power over the K-3 reading program to the department from the State Board of Ed. However, the State Board will still direct the policies and rules of the program. Additionally, the department must approve the plans for programs before districts get the money. If you are an A or B district, you are only required to submit these reports every other year. And the last bill, but certainly not least, Senate Bill 1219. I'm sure you guys have seen this one in articles or on the news. The bill came to the legislators' attention after a girls' basketball game in Flagstaff where players were wearing traditional Navajo buns in celebration of the Native American Culture Night and were asked to remove these by the referee. The bill is set to resolve this issue by restricting governing boards and interscholastic athletic associations from prohibiting students engaged in extracurricular activities from wearing religious or cultural accessories or hairpieces, as long as it does not jeopardize the health or safety of other students. And those are the last of the past ones.
Now we get to bills that failed to pass.
And, you know, these are the kind of things that lobbyists don't normally get credit for, but believe me, the lobbying team was intimately involved in many of these actions.
Okay, the first one is simple in terms of it's House Bill 2401, school desegregation funding phased down. I guess there's no secret that Arizona Tax Research Association and some other groups hate deseg because of what it does to local property taxes in their mind, and they over the years have tried different ways to attack it. They've put a freeze on it. It's been frozen for a number of years, and 2401 was an attempt to basically phase it. Not only is it frozen, but phase it out over the next 10 years, and obviously that bill didn't make it. The next one, House Bill 2402, bonds disclosure notice, was another bad bill working its way through the session. It was especially bad for school districts. One of the things that would have required that when you had a bond election, you had to put in the issue to tell people that it was possibly going to raise primary property taxes. Well, for school districts, there's no way a bond can raise primary property taxes. So then they wanted to add a thing, well, it may force districts to spend money that out of their operational budget. But the one that was really bad was it basically you would have had to tell the voters this is what the tax rate would be if the bonds were sold at the maximum rate that they could be sold for. Where now the rate, property tax rate that is provided to people is the best estimate of what it would be. If you had to put down what the maximum would be, it would jack the estimated property tax way up, and it would be unrealistic because districts just don't sell bonds at the maximum rate unless there's a real crisis or a regional emergency. The next one is House Bill 2480, and we're going to let Mark talk about that one.
House Bill 2480 was a bill sponsored by Representative Olson, and it seeks to clarify and fix an issue that was put in place in last year's budget, last legislative session. And essentially what happened a year ago during the budget process is the legislature limited how much additional state aid would be provided to school districts in areas where total primary property taxes exceeded a constitutional 1% cap. And in the past, the state had funded additional state aid payments to any school districts in those areas to make up for the constitutional limit on primary property taxes. And we're talking about primarily school districts in Pinal County, in the city of Maricopa area, other areas of Pinal County, TUSD, and some areas in Maricopa County. What this piece of legislation did is
required school districts to essentially reduce their primary property tax rate and all other primary property tax levying in jurisdictions to lower their rate to get them under the 1% cap. And so it would have, if passed, it would have reduced the funding available to school districts to fund their operations, and it would have also capped primary property tax rates of some school districts and some local governments. Although this failed, this is an issue that's going to have to be clarified in the future through additional legislation, because it is left unclear out there what primary property taxes are available to different entities to operate. And although there's a requirement that certain local governments pay school districts, I know some of those local governments are paying in protest or not paying. So it's an issue that all entities affected by this are still exposed to, and there needs to be additional legislative clarification at some point.
And the one thing for schools that was really, well, there are a lot of things in the difficult, but any money that they didn't get from additional state aid that they would normally be entitled to, they would have had to reduce their budget spending by that amount. So that was a good one that didn't make it through, and I know Mark spent an awful lot of time working on and talking to legislators on that issue. It's a very difficult issue to explain, but certainly one very important to schools. Next one is House Bill 2478, and that's Chris's.
Okay, this is one we've seen before. We haven't seen it probably in about 10 years or so, but this would eliminate the requirement for a county school superintendent to hold a teaching certificate. We came out in opposition to this, and we were happy to see that it did not make it through. Next one. This, I alluded to this before. This was the big bill of the session on ESA expansion, and it sailed through the Senate, and it was also dual introduced on the other side, but it had trouble in the House. It never did get through the House floor. So even when Senate Bill 1279, which did get through the Senate, came over to the House, not only could it not get through the House Education Committee, it was actually withdrawn from that committee and run through House Appropriations. And it was amended. What basically the underlying bill was, the underlying bill was originally a full expansion to allow all students to be part of eligible for an ESA over time. The way it was amended in Appropriations was to allow any student that qualified for free and reduced lunch to qualify for an ESA. But even in that state, it came to the House floor a number of times, and a lot of work was done by a lot of people. Big kudos to the lobbying group that really worked this bill from the beginning of the session. A lot of kudos to our advocacy network as well in terms of getting those phone calls. This is one we're going to see again, and I honestly think that the reason this year anyway that we were able to beat it back was Prop 123. It muddied the issue and made it much more difficult for education advocates to get on board if we were going to be supporting 123 at the same time having a massive privatization expansion with ESAs. But make no mistake, we are going to be dealing with this each and every year, and it'd be much easier if we have some folks at the legislature that don't see it our way, because we will see this one again. Next one.
Okay, Mark.
Senate Bill 1287 was a piece of legislation that would have required districts to accept transfer credits from Arizona online schools in core competency areas without allowing us to do an assessment on the student to determine if they had acquired the related material. The bill failed in the House Education Committee after a lengthy and somewhat heated hearing on the bill. I'm sure it'll be back in a different form next year.
Okay, now the next one we're going to talk about is the 2015 Comprehensive Legislative Brief. Darby.
And that will be 2016. Legislative
We already have that one done.
Yeah,
Well,
that one's
Darby,
done,
you almost got out of
but
this some work.
Look for the 2016 comprehensive brief that I've been working on sometime next week. We're hoping to get it finished. We're just waiting on a few of the chapter numbers. So that will be all the bills that were introduced that got lost, that passed, that failed, and that were vetoed.
Okay, now policy update. Chris.
Okay, real quick, and you saw the litany of changes that were in House Bill 2190. Several of those will have some policy changes, considerable policy changes, and there are a number of other bills as well that have policy implications that we're looking at. You know, the JTED changes that, you know, the reform that came along. We do obviously serve JTED's policy needs as well, so we'll be looking at that. But what I wanted to use this time to talk about is the guidance or actually a press release that came out from jointly from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education last Friday, and it has to do with transgendered accommodation of schools and what the enforcement provision is with regard to that issue, whether it be transgender, gender identity, and those issues. It's basically the position of the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, and Department of Justice that the current civil rights statutes that prohibit discrimination based on gender are broad enough to encompass discrimination based on transgender or gender identity. And in putting that out, they basically made it clear this is their position. Now, if you've been watching the news at all lately, you know that this is a hot topic and all over the place, in Texas, in North Carolina, and a number of other places. And this is sort of continuing to be pressed in the courts. The North Carolina statute alone, I think, has 4 or 5 different challenges that it is facing right now. And we have a decision out of the district court which gives deference to OCR's position in their enforcement position, but that's been appealed to the Court of Appeals. And so basically what we're dealing with here is an evolving area of the law. I do believe that ultimately the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice guidance will be the law of the land. The issue is, when will we get there? And so we're intending to put out advice to our districts, give them copies of the material that came out on Friday, let them know what the position is of the Department of Education and the Department of Justice, and that essentially the existing discrimination statutes will be read by both of those entities to include gender identity as being encompassed in gender discrimination. So we will let them know that. We are hesitant to change the actual policy only because the law itself has not changed. Now, if we get a court decision that says that, we will change it right away, because court decision is just as good as a statute. But what came out from OCR and DOJ was merely a statement of where they are in terms of how they see the law, where they are in terms of how they will proceed on enforcement actions. But it's absolutely important, and people need to know about it, and we will make sure that they do.
Okay. All right. We've allowed some time for questions. We have a number that have been submitted. We'll kind of referee those here. First one that comes up kind of from an earlier discussion. Will the inflation, the base level, continue to change after the 10 years of Prop 123? That's yes. The base level adjustments are in perpetuity should Prop 123 pass. The 10-year window is only for the trust lands draw and the additional cash that was provided to schools. The revenue stream will need to be recreated after the 10-year period.
Okay, we have two questions, and Chris maybe can respond as we look at those. They're very similar. One is will Prop 123 dollars come to us now in spite of any legal challenge? And due to the slight margin of victory, do you see the possibility of someone getting an injunction to stop the funding?
For those that couldn't hear, the question had to do with any potential legal challenge and the timeliness of money distributions relative to that. And Chris will take that one.
Well, you know, the barrier for putting an injunction in place and stopping the disbursement of monies is a very high one. You know, a court would have to basically say that there's a likely chance for that party prevailing, and see great harm in doing so if they allow the disbursement to continue. So while it's possible, I don't see that happening. The second part of the question had to do with the closeness of the election. You know, the election could pass by one vote. It doesn't change the legal aspects of it. You know, it doesn't make it more likely that there will be an injunction if it's a close election or not. So on that, I'm not too concerned about that. There is another issue that has to go. I mean, obviously the most vocal critic of Prop 123 has been Treasurer DeWitt. And he has at times been kind of non-committal as to whether or not he would want to be involved in a lawsuit. My understanding of it is, however, is that, you know, the treasurer may not have standing to sue because while he is a trustee, he is one of 3 trustees, and the trustee board would have to take action to support that legal action. There's even a question of whether or not he as an individual or even as a state official has the authority to hire legal counsel to pursue that action. So, I mean, that's not to say that it couldn't come from someplace else, but you know, there have been a lot of work already done on these issues, including by the Governor's Council and by others that are involved, and we would certainly be right there to make sure that our position and the position of schools are represented in that discussion for sure.
And there was a question just to follow up with Chris. You can jump in, Chris, with the Enabling Act, and our legal team sought an opinion from Senator Flake's legal folks, and you might follow up on that.
Yeah, the Enabling Act, the issue is, you know, what the Enabling Act was amended in the late 90s to allow for a greater disbursement of funds. And then when we expanded the disbursement to 2.5%, essentially, you know, we were told we didn't have to change the Enabling Act, that it was essentially we were allowed to continue to draw upon that. And so there is a legal argument to be made that the Enabling Act itself is not does not need to be amended. If that turns out to be incorrect, I think that we will certainly seek an amendment to the Enabling Act and would hope that or expect that our congressional delegation, knowing that the people had supported it, would be behind it. So that all remains to be seen, but you know, I wouldn't worry about it if you're dispersing money to your people right now. I would not by any means be holding back if in fact it looks like we win.
Okay, a couple of questions about the $50 million that will be distributed. The first one was, is that are charters included? Charters are part of that calculation, both for the $50 million and the $75 million going forward. Again, it would be their weighted student count, the same weighted student count that's used in the distribution of the classroom site fund. So charters are covered under that. The only thing, as we talked today, one of the things that is slightly different for charters is charters don't qualify for the teacher comp, so they would just use the base level in the calculations without teacher comp. When the extra $350 million for 2017, how will the Department of Ed distribute that to school districts? I know that it gets added to the calculation when you do your budget limit calculation, just like tuition or other sources of revenue. So I'm guessing, and it's hard, I don't want to speak for the Department of Ed, but they would probably distribute that in the same way that they distribute basic state aid through a formula throughout the year, but we'll have to check and see what the Department of Ed wants to do on that calculation. The other question dealt with the extra $50 million changing all the time during the year as student counts change. Remember that $50 million will be distributed on the same weighted student count that the classroom site fund is distributed, and that's prior year. So it won't change because your student count is changing each year. For districts or charters, it's your student count that's from the prior year, so it'll continue to do that. So you shouldn't get fluctuation by changes in your student count.
There's a question there, Chuck or Mark, relative to how the whole harmless funds would be provided to school districts with declining enrollment.
Basically what will happen is the district's base support level, which is the major component of the funding formula, gets recalculated because of the ability to be able to use prior year count. So your base support level would get recalculated. That would be helping your budget limit calculation, and if you're a state aid district, that would lead to your receiving additional state aid. And I should have mentioned probably on the base support level, if you're a non-state aid district, your base support level would get recalculated to give you budget capacity. You wouldn't get any more state aid, but you would get budget capacity. Let's see another question up there. Is to combine the school plant funds into one. I believe the Auditor General, that would be a question for them to answer, but I think under the new provision of 151102, you no longer would have multiple funds under the school plant fund. You would just have one plant fund, but that'll be a question we'll have to ask the Auditor General for.
A couple of questions there relative to accommodating transgender students in school construction. And I would, with Chris on the line here, I believe that's certainly yet to be determined how we would manage that kind of a thing moving forward.
Adjacent ways. Yeah.
Invisible space or adjacent ways, right?
Right.
I think we did. I don't remember us going through there. Was it in there? No. That bill passed. I know we missed it.
We didn't include it in the presentation today. It'll be covered. There's a bill that passed on adjacent ways. It's Senate Bill 1117. It passed. It'll be covered in the report that all organizations put together. But what the original bill said is that you had to have the school facilities board validate your project prior to the levy for adjacent ways, which was very, very problematic. We had a stakeholders meeting and got an amendment on the bill that allows you to levy for adjacent ways like you always do, but it does require the school facilities board to validate that it is a legal project in compliance with state law, and that the bill was amended to say that, so it doesn't get in your way of actually levying for adjacent ways, but there is a process you have to include the school facilities board in. Then there's another piece of law that relates to that validation, because in 1117 we left out a time limit for the school facilities board to act. In House Bill 2091, there's a provision that goes into Senate Bill 1117 and says school facilities board's got 60 days to validate that the project's legal.
So 2190. Two other things for expenditures in adjacent ways that are going to be less than $50,000. You still have to send those to the school facilities board, but you don't have to wait for their validation to do the project. And it's important, sometimes the words that get used, and a lot of times you submit plans for approval, and this one clearly says validate, and all the SFB is doing, school facilities board, is validating that what you're spending that money on is legally allowed by law. It's not whether it's a good project or whether it's a needed project. It's basically that project is only being used for things that are legally allowed by law, and validate. Very rarely do you ever see that in statute, but that's intentional here, that their only role is to validate that it's a legal expenditure.
There's a question up there about the U.S. Department of Labor's guidance document on exempt employees. Actually, our national folks gave us an advisory document just earlier today. That guidance ruling does not apply to teachers and administrators. They have been exempted. and effective December 1, it changes the minimum salary threshold for non-highly compensated employees to $47,476 a year. So expect more guidance on that. You can reach these documents, through our national associations, all of them, but that takes effect December 1 of this year.
Right. That's also going to be a subject that we will talk about in depth at the ASBA Law Conference in September. A lot of things going on with the FLSA and exempt, non-exempt.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, one of the questions is on prior year count, and it basically says when you using prior year count, will the calculation still be based on 100-day ADM, and whether it's a part of the formula that's going to be funded on prior year count, or it's part of the formula that's funded on current year count, it's still basically the 100th day average daily membership, the 100-day student count. And then I see a question, did I hear correctly, no longer required to pay a fee for tax credit expenditures? That's sort of correct. Basically, right now, the Attorney General has ruled that the only programs that qualify for the extracurricular activity tax credit are those activities that have a fee. This doesn't change whether you can have a fee. It just says if you have a program that you don't have a fee for, but it's an extracurricular activity, you can still accept extracurricular activity tax credit donation. Let's see what else. The funding for the $50 million for FY fiscal year 16 that's coming to schools and charters. Where is that on the budget pages? I believe that the Auditor General is putting that on the same page where you actually calculate your limit, where you would put tuition income and where you put other sources of revenue in. But those forms, I think, are coming out later this month. Okay, were there different versions of loosening the requirements for spending tax credit funds? I think the only change, and other people can comment, was the one about you don't have to charge a fee anymore. I don't think they made any other changes.
Well, no, I mean, the guidance is still out there in terms of what qualifies, but I mean, the Attorney General's office has been, very strong in their holding schools to the requirement that there be a fee associated with an activity for it to be eligible. And that this is what it mainly accomplishes, that it eliminates or allows those activities that do not have a fee to be eligible for tax credit donations.
Chris, but on loosening the spending of the tax credit money, I don't think except for the fee change, there made any other changes on what you could use the money for.
No, that's really only it, but it's a significant one because they had put an enforcement emphasis on that.
And then the other question is, and just to re-emphasize it again, is the $50 million in FY17 over and above the change in the base level rate? Yes. Every year that $50 million and $75 million is extra. And I think we have people that have other appointments and have to go to other places, so we're probably going to have to end the webinar. We appreciate everybody, and we hope that you got some good information out of it. Anybody else want to add anything in parting?
No, we just appreciate your continued support and encouragement, and we all believe that together we can accomplish a lot more than we can individually. So thanks for your help this session.
And but one parting comment, was really good this year to have the Mark and the Elizabeth, some of the people who are contract lobbyists working together with the people directly working for the school districts and working for the different organizations, and it really worked well with people pulling together. And well, one person wasn't able to get a contact on, somebody else was. So really, I don't think I've ever seen it work better than it worked this particular session. So I want to thank everybody for working together. And I guess that's the end of our webinar. Thank you, and have a good day or what's left of it.